Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name is Sagar Utekar and this is day 7 of our free CK series. I am super happy and thankful for all of you for supporting this free CK series. And yeah, let's get started. Today we are going to discuss very interesting topics which most of the courses don't cover, but I feel this is very important for your Kubernetes exam, not only CK but for all Kubernetes exam, be it CKD, CK, or CKS exam. Okay, so that's what we are going to discuss. In the very first video, I told you that in CK exam or CKD, we get multiple Kubernetes clusters and we need to know how to switch between those multiple Kubernetes clusters as well as how to access those Kubernetes clusters. What are the things actually works behind the scene? And today we are going to decode that actually. Let's get started. Okay. So for this demo, I'm going to use Kind tool so that I'll cover one more tool, which is very popular and being used for the Kubernetes cluster installation. Kind was actually designed for testing Kubernetes itself, but then now it has become so much popular and we can use similar it as a Minikube. So it is alternative for Minikube. And with the Kind, you can run your local Kubernetes cluster which creates all your cluster nodes inside the containers. Isn't that amazing? I hope you remember what is the benefits of containerization and how it helps to save the cost of the resources as well as the time management and how quickly we can spin up the containers. So just think that and compare kubeadm installation with the Kind installation now. When I am saying with the Kind, you can create a Kubernetes cluster, entire Kubernetes cluster with the help of containers. You don't need to go to AWS and create multiple instances, configure them, and all those process. Okay. Uh, then how much time we are going to actually save and how it is easy it is going to be. Okay, so let's start with that. For Kind cluster, you only need Docker install. So you already know how to install Docker. You can install Docker desktop. We have discussed that in detail. So if you want, if you have not done, you can go to this link and install Docker desktop for your machine. I'm assuming you're following this video and this series, so you don't need to install all those tools again and again. Okay, so let's just jump into Kind installation. There are multiple ways for installing your Kind. You can install it using release binaries or from the source, but my favorite is it using package manager. Only command you need to run on your Mac is brew install Kind. You can check out for other operating systems as well. Fine. Once you have Kind install on your machine, you can start creating cluster. You need to write one config file, which is very easy. You can find that config file on the Kind official documentation, as well as I'll also share this config file on my GitHub README, so you can use this as well. So, without ado, let's start actual hands-on. That's our motto. We are going to perform so hands-on. We are not going to only focus on clearing CK exam. We will see it from how to do a local development, how to do a production development on Kubernetes cluster. Okay, perfect. So I have two different kind configs. Let me show that. First one is very easy. And this is the structure of your Kind configuration file. You need to use the Kind uh, as a cluster API version, which is provided by the Kind, and the number of nodes you want. So if you want 3 control plane nodes, just define 3 roles of the control plane. And if you want uh, 3 worker nodes, then define that. If you want one single control plane and one worker node, what you'll need to do is that remove these extra entries of the control plane and the worker nodes, and it will create single control plane, single worker node. Isn't that amazing? Okay. Then I have one more kind config, which is little advanced and useful for showing me the demo, which we are going to do today in this video. So just remember that we are adding extra configurations into worker role, extra port mappings, and we are doing some port mapping of the container port with the host port 32,001, 2, and 3. So let's remember this, okay? And let's start creating our um, clusters first, and then we will discuss how to access those different clusters, how to jump from one cluster to another, and what are the things needed for accessing Kubernetes cluster. Creating kind cluster is very easy. I have put the instruction here. This is the command you need to use. Okay, so kind create cluster, the config file name for my config. The name of my config file is kindconfig.yaml. I'll use this config file and create first cluster, demo cluster. Okay, and it is doing some operation. We will come back here, but for before that, let me show you my Docker desktop, and here you will see it has started spinning up some containers for my demo cluster. First one is external load balancer, and then it has created 3 containers for worker node and 3 containers for control plane nodes. Okay, let's stop. Now, similar like our Kubeconfig setup, it is going to start the control plane. It is going to configure control plane, then configure your worker node. It will add other control plane nodes to the primary control plane as well as other. It will so this is what it is doing, joining more control plane nodes. It is also going to join the worker nodes to this same cluster. Okay, so this may take some time. What I'll do, I'll create one more cluster using same config kind create cluster. We will use the same config file and create test cluster. So let's think the such file. Sorry. So I need to now it should do. So it will create one more cluster, and that's it, right? It created our first cluster within a couple of seconds only. And that is how much the strength of the containerization. If you again compare with your kubedm setup installation and this installation, you can just think about the time taken for the kubedm setup and for this setup. Not only that, if you go to your um, this cluster, sorry, Docker desktop and check your containers. Okay, this is my containers. This is the image and the container. Okay, so check out the size of the image. It's in think it is heavy image, but it is in GBs, and though even if it is this file size is that much, you can see how much quicker it was for to start your Kubernetes kind cluster. Okay, check out the sizes. Still, it's in GB. You can optimize it if you want. But yeah, so that is what I wanted to explain and compare your Kubedium cluster setup with your kind cluster setup. But don't use kind cluster for your production usage, as they have also mentioned. It is just for learning and testing, or you can use it into your CI pipelines when you want to do some testing on the Kubernetes cluster. and you want to save some cost on deploying all those EC2 instances, creating VPC and different resources into AWS account. Okay, perfect. Now we can check the kind clusters using kind get clusters command. And here you will see there are two different clusters, demo cluster and test cluster. I'll create one more cluster using the other config file, which we actually need for the demo. It's saying that, yeah. So I need to change the name to something else. I'll use the dev cluster for the demo. So we have two clusters ready. It was very quick. We created demo cluster. We created test cluster. Now we are creating one more cluster, dev cluster. And this is the cluster which we will use for our demo. Okay. So let this take time, and I will explain you the main topic of this video, which is accessing multiple clusters and how the things work behind the scene. So far, I'm assuming that you know whenever we want to access our Kubernetes cluster, we use one command line utility, which is your kubectl command line, which we already have installed on our machine. And then kubectl interacts with your API server. But how does kubectl knows that where does kube API server is running? And how this kubectl authenticates to the your kube API server? There must be something, right? And that's where your kubeconfig file comes into picture. So kubectl command line tool, it uses the kubeconfig file which is present into your home directory, and this is a path. By default, it checks for this directory and search for the config file. We will discuss what are the contents of that config file, but just first understand whenever you run any kubectl commands, it looks for the file into this directory with the name config. Okay. If you don't have that file present into this directory home.q, then you can also pass kubeconfig flag to your kubectl commands. But that's not advisable. You can't keep on providing flag to kubectl commands every time you run it. Instead of that, you can store your kubeconfigs into this directory, and kubectl will start working. Okay. So what are the contents of the kubeconfig file? There are three main contents of your kubeconfig file. It stores the cluster information, it stores the users information, and the context information. So what is the clusters information? Now, in your exam, you are going to get multiple clusters, and each cluster will have its own API server, right? And the so API servers where we want to access our Kubernetes cluster. So all that information will be stored into the clusters part of the config. Then now, who am I to access the cluster? How that is going to be defined? So that's where the users come into the config file. Users provide the authentication details of an existing user and the user which wants to access the Kubernetes cluster. Is it clear? I hope so. So just imagine that we have multiple clusters, production, development, and test. And I am a user who wants to access the Kubernetes cluster, production Kubernetes cluster, right? So I need to authenticate to that Kubernetes cluster, and then only I will be able to access the cluster. So all those authentication parameters, whatever are needed, that needs to be defined into the user section. The cluster which I want to access, that needs to be defined into the cluster section. And The context is a glue, we can say, which defines which cluster and which users wants to access it. Easy, right? Similarly, when we are thinking about multiple clusters, then there must be multiple clusters information, multiple users information, and multiple context. So when we want to access multiple Kubernetes clusters, so all this information needs to be present in your config file whenever you run the kubectl command, as well as we need to switch between the context, which means when I want to use my production cluster using prod user, I'll switch to that context. When I want to use the development cluster using the dev user, then I'll switch to that context. Easy, right? Yeah. So that's context switching is needed, and there are a couple of commands provided by kubectl config which we need to use. Okay, very easy commands. So there is very frequently used command which you need to understand is kubectl config current context, which means which is the current context set for my kubeconfig file, which will define in which Kubernetes cluster you can perform the operation and which user you can use for performing the next couple of operations. So whenever you want to use any particular context, you need to check that which is the current context before doing any operation. Yeah. Now we have 3 clusters ready. We can check that kind git clusters again, and let me show you the actual kubeconfig file of these 3 clusters. So if I go here and search for the config file, it will show the clusters information, the URL of the cluster, Kube API server, okay, then CA data, as well as there are multiple clusters information. Why? Because we have 3 different clusters: dev cluster, test clusters, and the demo cluster. Similarly, when we also have the users information. So what is user? The users will have the client certificate data and the client key data, which means which is very important to authenticate authentication to the any particular cluster, because we don't want to provide any random person to access our Kubernetes cluster, which means the authentication is done by the user's client certificate and the client key. um, I'm going to discuss the authentication and the authorization part much more in detail in the upcoming videos. But before setting the ground level, uh, I am just setting the ground level for the upcoming videos. Okay. And there is one more section as we discussed the context. What context does is context only binds your cluster with the respective user, which means when I want to access my demo cluster, I need to use the context name, and with that I'll be able to access the cluster with that particular user. I don't need to specify the cluster and the user details every time. This will help me to switch between the context. Okay, you can check the context using kubectl config and git context. Okay, now there are 3 contexts, and this is a mapping. So this is context name, this is cluster name, and this is a user. The star represent the current set context, which you can also check using kubectl config current context command. Uh, kubectl config let me check. Kubectl config current context. It's a typo. Yeah. So it is showing the dev cluster is a current context, which means whatever operation I'm going to do next using kubectl, if I'm going to run kubectl get pods, get nodes, all those operations will perform on the dev cluster. It will not perform on any random cluster. Okay. Let's check that kubectl get pods. There are no pods in the default namespace, fine. And You'll see here, these are the pods from the dev cluster. If I check the nodes of the dev cluster, I can just do kubectl git nodes, and it will show me the nodes only which are related to dev cluster. It's not showing the nodes from the other cluster. So that is how the distinguish is being made here with the config context. If I want to switch to some other context, I can do the kubectl config and use context command, use context, and just give the name of the context. I'll not provide the cluster and the username. Okay. And this will switch to the other cluster. This is the main part which people face to understand and as well as do the mistake during their certification exam. They forgot to switch the context while solving the question. So that's why I'm saying again and again that you need to understand this concept well. And whenever you are solving any CK, CKD or CK's question, make sure you are into the right cluster and using the right user to before solving the question. Okay. And now I hope it is very clear how to switch between the context, how to check the context and everything else. Perfect. So as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, that for the demo, I'm going to use the context or the cluster, dev cluster for the practical. So to switch to that context, I'll use the command kubectl config, use context and the context name. Okay, now I'm accessing my dev cluster and I can perform the actual kind demo. Okay, and so this is what I'm going to do next. I have one demo application and the image is present on my local machine. And which image, by using that image, I want to create a pod into my kind cluster. So for that, uh, what I'm going to do, I want to load the local image into my kind cluster. Okay. So I'll use one more command called kind load Docker image. The name of the image is getting started. Getting started. The tag is latest. And I want to load this image into Dev cluster. So this is the one problem when people must find while doing the practicals on Minikube and kind, at how to use the locally built image into the kind or Minikube cluster. And I have covered those things into my videos. So you can build your Docker image using Docker build command locally and load that image into your kind cluster using kind load Docker image command. So it is loading that image onto all of our cluster nodes. It is going to take some time. After that, what we are going to do is that we are going to run a sample application using this image. Okay, getting started image. This is the image we are going to use for running our demo application. And to access that or expose the container on our node ports, we are going to expose that deployment using kubectl expose deployment command and the port of it. This is one more issue which people face while using a kind, how to access the application from your kind cluster to your local machine. So there is very good documentation here. Okay. Uh, extra port mappings here. So extra port mappings can be used to port forward to the kind nodes. This is a cross-platform option to get traffic into your kind cluster, which means our application is running inside a container, but the container is also running on the kind cluster. And as we discussed, kind itself is running inside a Docker container. So for that reason, we need to have the mapping of our local host port to the node port where our application is running or accessible. Okay, so if you are running Docker without a Docker install, no, that this is not important. But this step we did for our dev cluster. So what we did, we added one parameter, extra port mappings, and map the port, uh, host port with the container port. And this is what we are going to do. We have performed this step. We are just deploying our application and it should be accessible. So this is the mapping. Whatever the port of your service, node port of your service is there, that you need to expose with while creating a kind cluster. So kind of the drawback we can say, and because we don't know the node port which will be get assigned to your node port service, but there is one way which you can modify the node port. So we will check that. Okay, is it done? Yeah. So now our image is present into kind cluster. We can use our application demo file to start the application. I think it should be present directory here. Yeah. This is the same file, deployment file, present on my GitHub Repo. So I'll use this file to deploy my application. When you do the kubectl apply -f, it's going to deploy this application on dev cluster. Okay. Now we do the kubectl git pods and the deployment. It will show us the running pod and the deployment. Yeah. Okay, now we want to expose this application with the kubectl expose deployment command, and it will create a service, Nodeport type of service. Okay. Now to access this Nodeport service, you will need to log in into your kind container and then access it. But we don't want that. What we want is, I want to access this application from my Mac. So for that reason, we already did the first step while creating our kind cluster. So whatever we want to do the mapping of our host port with a container port 30,000 of the kind container. Okay. The next thing is, now if you check the services, kubectl get service, it will show us that there is new service hello kind created, but the node port is something else. This is not where our application is running, or this is not a node port which we are expecting. So to edit that, you can run one more command, kubectl edit service and the hello kind, and change the default port assigned to this kind service. I'll update this one parameter and make it 30,000. Okay. Now, if you do the kubectl get services, you will see the node port has been changed to 30,000. So let me pull one white port, and this is what we did. Our entire Kubernetes cluster is running inside a container, right? And we exposed our application with the Nodeport service, which is running on 30,000 port. But that 30,000 port, to access the application, we will need to log in into the kind cluster or the kind node and then access it. But we need one more level of mapping here to that port. Let's say I'll, yeah, yeah, 30,000 is the port of our Nodeport service. So what we are doing, is that we are going to access our application from local machine, and which will forward the traffic to the node port, and then node port will forward the traffic to the respective containers. So that is what needed here, which you can now see on your Docker desktop as well. If you go to the containers, that some of the containers, not them, for the dev cluster related. So let me search for the dev containers. Okay. You can now access the application which is running inside your kind cluster from local machine. Perfect, it is accessible. Okay, so this is kind demo one. Say you can access and perform anything here. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to show. The parts where you will get stuck most of the time, which is not the installation. Installation is very easy. It is one line command. The next thing is while creating your cluster only, you need to specify the port mappings for your node ports and the host ports. And then uh, how to load the locally built image into your kind cluster. That is the second thing you need to always remember. And the third thing is you need to use the same node port for your service, which you have defined into your cluster configuration. So many things we have learned today. Um, I'm sure you will be very excited to do this practical and do this hands-on. The next thing I'm going to explain is the authentication and the authorization. Today, in the kubeconfig file, we saw there is entry for the user, and there were some entries of the client key data and the client certificate data. So that part I will explain how the authentication and the authorization happens in the Kubernetes cluster. And as an anonymous user, we don't want to give sorry. So we don't want to give the access to any anonymous user to our cluster. We want to have the secure communication between for any user to the Kubernetes cluster, as well as for the components which are running inside your Kubernetes cluster. So how to make it secure by using authentication and the authorization uh, things. So yeah, so next video is also going to be very interesting, and I guess that's it for now. Thank you very much for showing the support again, and please keep sharing your learnings on the social media. Tag me into your post. I'll be very happy to support you there. And if you have any questions, drop those into comment. I'm also active on social media, so you can reach out to me on my LinkedIn, and we will try to solve those issues. Okay, that's it. Bye bye.